So thank you very much. I'd like to welcome all of you here in the theater and all of you who are watching this on live stream as we speak. And I send a welcome from the past to those of you who are now watching this in the future on video on lionsroar.com. The subject of the uses and abuses of power is, of course, the central social and political question of all time, but it does feel particularly acute now. The bad news is that that feels particularly acute because of unfortunate developments happening in our world. A good way to look at it is that it feels acute because of ever-increasing awareness of the ways that power is abused in our society and ever-deepening insight into the systemic issues that are involved in these, as well as these psychological, moral, and spiritual issues. So this evening, we're going to be discussing the issue of power, its proper use, and its abuses in the spiritual context. And to discuss that, we will have, I think, a lot of deep insight from really an outstanding panel that we have to discuss this topic. All three are well-known Buddhist leaders, and the sad truth is, much as we might have hoped otherwise, that Buddhism is as susceptible to the abuse of power as every other religion or indeed human institution. All three of our panelists have experienced spiritual authority from really both sides of the coin, both as practitioners and students themselves, and now also as now teachers and leaders. And so I think they'll have a lot to offer to us about both how it's abused as well as hopefully how it can be used properly. I'll give you only a brief introduction because I think that we'll learn more about each of the panelists in the actual panel discussion itself. But starting closest to me is Gina Sharpe, who is a leading teacher in the Insight meditation tradition, a founder of New York Insight, and a co-leader of the teacher training program at Spirit Rock Meditation Center. In the center is Pilar Jennings, who is a teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and a psychoanalyst and a lecturer at a Union Theological Seminary. She is the author of Mixing Minds, The Power of Relationship in Psychoanalysis and Buddhism, and therefore is ideally situated to give us in addition to a Buddhist perspective, a psychoanalytic perspective on all forms of mentor-mentee relationships. Finally, on the far end is Roshi Pat Enkyo O'Hara. She is the leader of the Village Zendo here in New York, a member of the Zen Peacemakers Order, and really, fair to say, one of the most important women teachers in American Zen, if I may.
That's very kind.
I think that all three come from a deep Buddhist practice and experience, but at the same time, it's our hope that this discussion, like the subsequent two that will follow over the course of this year, will not be aimed only at issues that take place within the Buddhist world, but from a Buddhist perspective, offer insight and wisdom that can be applicable across all spiritual traditions and indeed in society as a whole. I would just note before I turn it over to the panel that we will have a question and answer period so that you will indeed have an opportunity to have some discussion with the panel.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Melvin. What we thought we'd do at the beginning is each one of us will just speak a little bit about our background in our spiritual tradition and its relationship to the power issues that we've encountered. So I'm going to say a few words, and then Pilar is going to say a few words, and then Gina. I think that's the order.
It's fine.
Oh, no, we're going in the order
matter.
of the ancient traditions. But anyway, never mind. As you can see by my outfit, I'm a Zen Buddhist. I look a little traditional, but that can fool you. So Zen Buddhism has always been touched with really difficult power issues. And in fact, the main way that Zen approaches that is through koans and stories, which are really dialogic in nature. And if you read them, they're always about this confrontation and this kind of power work that the teacher and the student are doing together. So rather than being just giving the teachings, there's always this kind of feisty back and forth. However, teacher almost always wins. We treasure the koans where they don't. But that's the ancient tradition. I'm very lucky. I came upon Zen when I was more mature. I began to practice, I began to read about Buddhism in my teens, really. But I didn't find a practice until I already had a certain amount of maturity and clarity. And so I think that that's really important because I wasn't naive. And my first entry was into, the Buddhism in the mid-century of last century was what we call modernist Buddhism. So it wasn't really the ancient ones that we read about. It was kind of like what had been changed by the West, and particularly Zen. So Zen communities in the 70s and 80s was very influenced by the sexual revolution, very influenced by counter-cultural ethos. So it wasn't some kind of ancient tradition. It was really what was happening at that time. So I was a little mature, and therefore I didn't drink the Kool-Aid. I found a place upstate New York, a monastery. But why did I go even? Because I had read for years. I was kind of an academic. I knew how to read. Because I wanted to find a method. I wanted to find a way to practice, a form of practice. And I admired the aesthetics of the Zen tradition. And so I went to a monastery and practiced there as much as I could, leading a lay life. I learned to meditate, I learned to work, I learned all the forms. And I learned those from my teacher. My teacher was an American, and we could say there's a little Wordsworthian suspension of disbelief. I mean, I knew he had the authority, he was a sensei, and yet I could see that he was in many ways a kind of broken man. And how wonderful that he still, despite that, chose to try and share the tradition. And so in that way, I was able to follow his ways of doing things and yet not myself feel like a victim of his power. Until I did. And it wasn't this kind of sexual thing with me. It was about his appropriate action with other Sangha members. And I left him, and I went to study with Mayuzumi Roshi in California, who was very soft and sweet then because he'd already been through some terrible scandals of alcoholism and sleeping around. And so he had gone through that period, and he was staying with his wife, and he wasn't drinking, and he was Japanese, and so there's all that kind of idealization. And I learned a lot from him, but I also could see he was a broken man, right? So it didn't make me think that if I somehow practiced Zen, I would now be perfect. And in Japan, everybody knows that. All of the teachers are like they're broken people, or they're regular people. They're not like some sort of enlightened being sitting on a cloud. Roshi died. Mayuzumi Roshi died, and My last 2 years of study before I was authorized as a teacher were with Bernie Glassman, another wonderful Zen teacher who was one of my Izumi Roshi's successors. And through Roshi Glassman, I would say his use of power with me was I worked for him. I did a lot of work, and I learned a lot. So his use of power, if it was any kind of negative way, it would have been that. All three of those teachers married women students of theirs. Okay? So this was all mid-century going into the last part of the 20th century. And that was not shocking to people. That was acceptable at that time. And again, think about the times, countercultural times, sexual revolution, a lot of different things were permissible that are no longer permissible because we realize that actually they're really very harmful. Inappropriate relationships, inappropriate ways to teach. So I came out of all of that, and now I've been teaching for 25 years. To me, the most important thing is to be modest, to make people know your faults. So I pretty much, almost every Dharma talk I give some ridiculous joke about how I messed up again, screaming at the doorman or whatever. So they don't think that there's some idealized place to be. I think it's very important. I'll touch on some other things later. I don't want to take any more time, other than the fact that I've had training and boundary training, and all the seniors in my community must go through a training period where they learn about the difficulties of power, power imbalances. And I feel very strongly about that. It's really important because we don't know, we don't realize it. But that's all I want to say at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'll talk a little bit about my own experience as a practitioner and a little bit about what I've seen since I've been authorized to be a teacher. So I came to Buddhism because when I was in my late teens, I had a spiritual teacher. And I used to have private meetings with her once a week. And one day and she was a psychic. And one day I walked into the meeting with her, and she looked at me and she went, "Buddhism." I said, "Okay." I trusted her, and obviously for good reason. And I said, "Well, what do I do?" And she said, "Buddhism." So I went to what was called Samuel Weiser's bookshop. I don't know if that's still around in the village, is it?
No, it's not in the village.
But in those days, it was one of like 3 exclusively spiritual bookstores. And I cleared the bookshelf, the Buddhist bookshelf, which was at that point about this wide, right? And it was people like Trungpa Rinpoche and all of those writers from the early mid-20th century. And I just read all of that, and then I went back to her and I said, "It says that you should meditate. How do I meditate?" And she said, "Well, every morning when you wake up, just sit on your bed and meditate." So I did. I didn't know what that was supposed to be. And I did that for about 15 years, I think, every morning. I was a good student. I did what I was told. And then, of course, after a while, Buddhism became more popular, and people like Jack Kornfield and writers like that got into the field. And So I read Jack's first book called Path with Heart, which touched me deeply. And a few years later, a friend of mine used to go on retreats, and he said, and so he'd go and I'd make fun of him because it sounded like Boy Scout camp to me. And one day he said, I'm going on retreat next week, and he said, with a teacher named Jack Kornfield, and I said, I'm going. So I went, and I was very moved by the practice, and it felt as if those 10 days just began to deepen what I had been reading about, and I actually had the experience of it rather than the thought of it. And I wrote Jack a note and got back asking to see him at the end of the retreat because I wanted to thank him. And I got a note back that said that essentially was addressed to about 30 people, because apparently everybody, the other 29 people, had also asked to see him. And it said, I don't know how I'll be at the end of a retreat. It's usually busy. I don't know if I'll be able to see you. So I wrote back and I said, no problem, just give me an address. I'd like to send you a thank you card. And I got a note back that said, see me at 2 o'clock. And that started a relationship, a student-teacher relationship with Jack that led to eventually my being authorized by him to teach. So it's a slightly different trajectory than Pat's, but not dissimilar. And I really have seen power, its uses and abuses, mostly from the point of view of not so much the sexual peccadillos of teachers, but really from the point of view of the misuse of power. That actually what I recognized, and by the way, Pat, my tradition's older than yours. It's Theravada.
I know.
So practicing in the Theravada tradition, it's a monastic tradition mainly, so that the kind of abuses that we're talking about now really were probably happening, but well behind the scenes, so I didn't know about them. But I think what I've noticed in terms of power and its use and abuse is essentially that because the Theravada tradition was brought here by lay people, essentially the use of power is not something that's been really conscious in our training. And as Melvin mentioned, I'm in a training. I'm a teacher in a training program right now, and it's one of the topics that we feel is really incredibly important, because power is implicit, and it's invisible in so many ways that I think, and it's that because we have systemic negligence, really, in educating ourselves about the use of power, about seeing the power that is invested in us when we have authority as teachers, and how to actually use it benevolently rather than toxically. I'm a little bit shy of talking about it only in the manner of sexual abuse, because I think that topic becomes so titillating and so compelling that we miss a really large issue of how power is wielded and used, and the systemic negligence in not educating people about power, and also in training them about its uses, both from the point of view of the student as well as from the teacher. And I'll stop there for now, too.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So good to be here. Wonderful to hear you. Gina and Enkyo, two teachers whom I admire so much. And Perhaps I'll also just tell you a little bit about how I came to the Buddha Dharma. I was a child, very young, and happened to be in Southern California in the 1970s, where all things Buddhist were rather pervasive, and I was hanging out at the famous Bodhi Tree bookstore with my mother. Perhaps some of you remember it. It was a great bookstore. And we also hung out at that shelf, and we're just having a look at some of the literature that was very compelling to my mother, and I think I was intuiting that there was something here that I could pay attention to. And we saw a flyer for a meditation class. I was about 9, and so I remember just the innocence of the experience of being in this room full of adults who were not talking, and I just thought that was so fantastic. I just loved it. I just loved it so much, and all the women were wearing Birkenstocks and long, pretty skirts, and the men had beards. And there was something so gentle about these adults that I found very compelling. And so it stuck with me. I was a very introverted kid, and so it was just so appealing to me to imagine that this was an option for adulthood, right? To feel close, to feel connected, but in this gentle, non-coercive, very respectful way. So for many years, like Gina, I basically hung out on cushions and on my bed and in chairs and at meditation centers, mostly in the insight meditation tradition, learning to practice and learning to just observe the extraordinary tumult of the mind. And that continued to be a very compelling process for me until I was solidly in my 20s, and I was learning a little bit about the Tibetan tradition, and primarily the model for the teacher-student relationship, which is so emphasized in the Tibetan tradition. It's very devotional. The Mahayana path is very devotional. And there was something to me that seemed so heart-centric about that devotionalism that I felt very attracted to. So because I was still introverted, I basically observed a lot of different sanghas and different teachers until I really found myself immersed in a particular lineage and working closely with the teacher, Khenpo Pema Wangdak, who's spoken here many times. And during that time, I was also training to become a psychoanalyst. I think for me, this has something to do with being a New Yorker, even though I ended up in Southern California for that period of time. The Dharma really underscored the reality of psyche, right? That the mind was just so multifaceted, right? So ever-present, so complex. And I think I was, I'm not sure I was privileging psyche over spirit, but very drawn to understanding it. And so while I was really immersed in spiritual practice, I felt called to somehow bring that experience into clinical work. So it was interesting for me to be training to become a clinician while I was so immersed in this tradition that encouraged practitioners to see our teachers as a Buddha, right? To see all beings as Buddhas, right? But to really feel the reverence, this profound devotion for our teachers. And at the same time, I was just immersed in a lot of clinical literature, having a look at those human longings for powerful, idealizable other. And so I was often basically covertly analyzing all of my Sangha members respectfully, and my dynamics with my teacher. I will say I feel extremely fortunate because my teacher, while he was raised in a Buddhist culture and therefore not psychologically oriented in the way I am, I experienced him as being very psychologically curious. And so he was often asking me, what's the deal with Freud? And what was actually going on between Freud and Jung? You tell me. And sometimes saying things that were irksome to me, as in, I suspect that once somebody really is committed to the Dharma, then something like therapy surely must be irrelevant. I don't see it that way. I didn't see it that way at the time either. But we could grapple, right, with the relevance of these different approaches to the human condition. So I do feel a gratitude because with him, I felt real spaciousness for mutuality. Even though we were in this tradition where I was encouraged to be highly deferential, there was some room to challenge, to say, well, there are multiple perspectives that we could explore to understand the mind. The Dharma is one extraordinary perspective, and there are others. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I became a Dharma teacher many years later, after I had begun my clinical practice. And I only did so because people were asking me to teach. I'm still an introverted person, so I'm very comfortable being in the consulting room one-on-one, very comfortable with solitude. But it is such a gift to be in conversation with people who are drawn to these healing arts, and then be able to look at how psyche and spirit converse. So perhaps we'll do that together tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. You touched on something that is so important to me. It's, and let me just share our introversion.
Yes, me too.
The three. And so why do we do it? Why put yourself out there and give talks and see people all the time and allow yourself to be a brand? You know? Why? When it's like kind of painful. And of course, it's the uses in the title of this panel. Yeah. The uses of leadership, of spiritual authority. I mean, you know, I don't know what spiritual authority actually is, but it is, you know, someone who studied really hard, practiced for many years, has run into all these ghosts and dreadful places, and can kind of like say, oh, watch out there, go, you know, go this way, read this, consider this, and then all the kind of like business aspects of kind of being sure there's a place for the community to practice and all of that. For me, those are the uses of spiritual authority. It isn't about what isn't it about? All the downside, the dark side that we don't really want to talk about tonight, but we have to.
Yeah.
It isn't about manipulating people. It isn't about hurting people. And it's not just sexual, it's all kinds of interpersonal ways. And when that can happen, there's abuse of money, there's abuse of people's time. You know, you really have to watch out. Who's cleaning the floors at the Zendo all the time? What's going on there? Are we abusing that person? So it's that kind of awareness of what's happening. And of course, I'm just talking in very simple ways, but there are abuses that can be financially. I mean, we have lots of history of that. And if you move outside the Buddhist realm into the other major traditions, I don't have to tell you about it, do I? Lots of abuse of spiritual authority. It's very concerning. And it's always helpful when we work with people, and when you work with people, and someone who's got an excitement about the spiritual path, is to help them to understand that they have to stand in the middle of that. They have to have their own power in order to follow whatever way it is, whether it's a Theravada, Vajrayana, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever it is, right? I'm finished.
Maybe I'll just add, Enkyo, in analytic work we talk about the need for asymmetry, right? That of course it's so important in any healing diet to feel that there's a sense of being a fellow traveler, right? That we're both human, we've both suffered, we both struggle, neither one of us have it all figured out, and yet there is a need for some asymmetry, right? For someone to have some awareness, some knowledge, some training, some responsibility, right? So this is a generative use of power. It's just a matter, right, of how it's held. And as Enkyo was saying, right, when it's held skillfully, then usually the idea is to help the other locate those resources, that power internally. It's just when it gets exploited, which can so easily happen, but not for random reasons, right? I think we can understand a lot about why that asymmetry can be exploited, but doesn't have to be, right? And so I've needed my teachers, right, who know more than I do, right, in order to feel that there's somewhere to go that's healing, in order to be inspired.
Right.
Right. We just need the good enough teachers, right, who are boundaried. Yeah.
All of those who have good enough teachers, put your hands up. I want to see.
Amen. Yeah.
So I'd like to just add something about, because we're talking about that personal relationship between teacher and student, and how key that is really to the whole spiritual path, and specifically the Buddhist path. But as Enkyo said, it's not confined to the Buddhist path. I think it's true in all of the spiritual traditions, whether Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Buddhist. But I'd like to talk, just to mention that all of these relationships are operating in a system. And that part of, I think, what we're seeing, especially with the particular scandals that are happening these days, is the lack of a system to really deal with these inequities and inequalities in the relationship that cause abuse. And in my particular, now I'm going to talk about the modern tradition that's younger than yours, the insight tradition, which is part of the Theravada tradition. It came to America in the 70s. Right. So we're really young. And the people who brought it here were essentially in their 20s. I don't even think their executive brains had been developed yet completely, right? So, and certainly they had not had worldly experience. They'd all gone to India and Thailand and Burma and practiced there and got on fire, which is beautiful. And yet, so when they came back and established centers, those centers were, hippie centers, basically. Yeah. Everybody wanted to practice and were in love with the practice, and they brought monks over, and the monks did, long retreats, and we all got very inspired by those retreats. And yet, there was no examining of subjects such as we're doing tonight. There was no acknowledgement that with authority as a teacher, comes power. And that power is very capable, because we're human, of being abused and misused, and can really hurt people. So what I left out of my short bio is that in between discovering Buddhism as something to read about and practice, kind of, and actually becoming deeply involved as a practitioner, I practice law. And so I'm very interested in structural integrity. And I think that's part of one of the problems that we have, one of the really profound problems that we have, is that in the structure, there is very little discussion about the fact that a teacher is invested with all of this power, and that it has the ability to be of enormous help, and it also has the ability to be of enormous harm. And how do we hold it as teachers, and what happens if we slip up and we actually hurt students? How do we do that? So some of the institutions in my tradition, Spirit Rock in particular, has what we call an ear council, which is ethics and reconciliation, so that there's a place for you to go if you feel you've been harmed by a teacher. But there is still very little discussion about what it means to be a teacher, and how we hold this longing that you were talking about, how we hold this longing in the student very delicately, as if we have someone's heart in our hands. And what does it mean to have the power to direct that, to help to direct it? What does it mean to have the power to actually listen deeply to someone who's been hurt by another teacher? What does it mean, and what are the skills that need to be developed to be able to hold that in a way that does no further harm? And what does it mean to know that we have this power, and to use it benevolently rather than toxically? And I know with all of the sexual scandals that are happening now, there's a tendency to associate power with that kind of abuse, but there are a lot of other kinds of abuse that maybe we won't have a whole lot of time to talk about tonight, but I think we need to at least put an asterisk on that the responsibility of a teacher is profound. To be able to, and it's a humongous privilege, to be able to be asked by a student to guide them. And so that has to be held delicately and profoundly, sensitively, and we as teachers have the responsibility to investigate what it means to have this power, and how is that used in a way that is not harming.
And I would say that in my tradition, at least I'm part of something called the White Plum Sangha, so it's 300 or 400 Zen centers in Europe and the States. And we're all we're at a time when it's time to look at the issues that you're talking about, Gina. That both in terms of our own use of power, and when we're authorizing new teachers coming up, that it isn't like it used to be, that you had to know the Dharma and be able to run a small business. Instead, it is about...
But you shouldn't call it a business.
These I know, but I'm real. But it is so much about what you're talking about, is what is power and how is it used sensitively and aware. I mean, right now in this time that we're in, you can see all the Dharma centers from the Vajrayana tradition and Theravadan tradition and the Zen all the Mahayana. We have ethics codes coming up. We have ombudsmen. We have all kinds of new techniques that we're trying to put together and beginning to offer teachings in this way, and teachings to the entire Sangha, and particularly to those people coming up that you recognize, well, that person could be a teacher in 5 years, so better get them on board now about what this is. This is the time, it's a very exciting time to be people becoming aware through the Me Too movement and other movements that have come up. Oh, there's so much more work to be done in this area. So but when you say systemic, you know, it's absolutely correct. I agree completely. And I think we are on it, but we always need to keep paying attention.
Yeah.
And individually, as practitioners, we need to pay attention at how am I? What is my relationship to power? You know, you might find that when you go to your doctor and you're afraid to ask the question. Or you're afraid, or a lawyer, or your therapist. Right? I mean, you have to own, we have to learn to own our power in all of these different situations, as well as when we have the power to open the space so that people are comfortable.
But you know, we never had, in my training, my teacher training, I never received any conversation, discussion, reading, thinking, nothing about about the topic of power. So I'm endeavoring, as Jack always says, to create the training that I wish I had.
Right.
Yes.
With the current teacher training, and we're doing a lot of talking about power and bringing people into who are not necessarily Buddhist,
Right.
but who really know a lot about power and have written beautifully about power.
We've been using a Christian group called I forget. I said the name earlier, but I forgot.
Olive Branch?
Olive Branch is one. Christians have been onto this a little bit earlier than the Buddhists. And so there are quite a few groups that go out and work with different groups, teaching. Common Boundaries is called. And they teach boundary issues and so forth to sanghas and to individuals. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, we were talking about this a little bit before the program began, that it feels like we're in a maturational process, maybe as American Buddhists. And I was struck, Enkyo, by your reference to how you routinely let your students know that you sometimes chew out the doorman, right? You're humanists. And I was thinking about Heinz Kohut. Some of you might know of his work. He was the founder of self-psychology, and he wrote very beautifully about how when we're very young children, one way we cultivate a feeling of safety is to feel safely merged, safely connected to an all-powerful, idealizable other. But that the so-called good enough caregiver or parent offers what he called optimal frustrations, non-traumatic, right, optimal frustrations, just to let the child see the humanness in a fractionated, digestible way of the parent. And I think the skillful Dharma teachers, they do that very intuitively to help the student mature, right, to help the student tolerate the humanness, the subjectivity of the teacher, right? Because without that, then the student might be calling on the teacher to give something, right? The fantasies can get mobilized of finally a safe merger. Maybe the student never had it before. Many of us are drawn to the Dharma because of our prior psychological pain or trauma, right? So I've often, that my wish has been that there would be a way to support spiritual dyads to explore the fantasy that might be arising in the student and pulling the teacher in, and might then mobilize the fantasy in the teacher, right? To finally be seen as an idealizable other and therefore be able to kind of split off from their own trauma. It just requires a lot of maturation. Yeah.
Sounds dangerous.
Slowly, right?
Yeah, bit by bit.
Yeah, bit by bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's we're stuck for a moment because that was just so powerful what you just said.
Yeah.
And the idea that, you know, I mean, we all idealize. It's so easy to do. And we want, and it is completely an ideal, you know, it's not a real thing. This is kind of like, oh, and then everything will be perfect and I will, you know all things and I'll be all one and plus I'll be successful. And, you know, and it's a little fantasy, but if it's not caught,
Yeah.
It's obscured and people don't make fun of it or don't notice it, and so it just kind of gets lodged in the psyche, and that's when the teacher gets excused for conduct that's not appropriate. Whether it's sexual or involves money or involves work, whatever kind of appropriation of the other that takes place.
And the spiritual bypass.
Yes.
Yes, why
That
don't you talk
happens
about that a bit?
because of the idealization of the teacher, so that there are traditions in which the teacher is held to be enlightening the student no matter what they're doing, right? And so the students, especially if they've been called to have special jobs or special students of the teachers, then become entranced by that. And the spiritual bypass of, oh, he's doing that really to enlighten me, right? No matter what the behavior is and how harmful it is and how outrageous it is, it's excused because there's the kind of getaway problem of that issue of the idealization of the teacher as part of the dance of the journey.
Right.
Yeah.
And with the idealization, right, and this is also just a little developmental piece, as children, right, we assume the burden of badness, right? This was Fairbairn's idea, that because we need to feel that we're in connection with someone who can care for us, right? We really cannot tolerate seeing the shadow in our caregiver. And I think that can get reenacted with our spiritual teachers, mentors very easily, right? And then if we have teachings to amplify that, the teaching of crazy wisdom, for instance, we can milk that for all it's worth, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think that the real point is to help people to study the teachings and to live their lives in an authentic and genuine way, right? And what I'm hearing is a lot about, that idealization, that thing that we do, and it's so easy to do. And then how do you dissolve that fantasy? Just catch it as you can, I think that's very important for the spiritual authority figure in a community to be able to catch it, and also for the community to be able to catch it among themselves.
Yes.
So that it can become part of what people talk about in the community. And so it's not like, oh, my teacher's so great, but, did you see that? Or, gee, I just caught myself really thinking that she did that because she was so enlightened, but actually she just dropped that cup. Or whatever. I mean, people are strange. When we get into and people are me too. We idealize, and then we can just make all kinds of stories up about whatever.
Yeah.
And so it is. I think this is the time in these times, I think this is the time of Sangha to also take some responsibility here.
Yeah.
It's not just the teachers, but the Sangha has to step up and help one another and create rules and ways, ethical statements and so forth that are followed. And just by raising everyone's consciousness, I think it'll make a big difference for this postmodern Buddhism that we're working on.
So what this is reminding me of is many years ago when the Dalai Lama first came to America, he appeared at, I think it was the theater at Madison Square Garden, and generously invited questions. And one of the questions was, how do I find a teacher? And he stopped and he considered for a moment, and then he said, well, when you find them, look them over for 15 years. and everybody laughed. Everybody did exactly that. And he said, and I mean in front of and behind the curtain.
Yeah, that's good.
Look at what they're like in their family life. Look at what they're like certainly as a teacher, but also look behind the curtain to see how they treat other people and what they do. And that stuck with, that was in the 80s, yeah. So it's about 30 years ago. And it really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really, and it sticks with me sometimes when I catch myself doing things that I would rather my students don't see me doing. Right?
Yeah.
Aha!
That's
You're behind the
great.
curtain, Gina. Right? So it really, it was beautiful advice, and I think it's even more important today, given all of the events that we're working with and dealing with, that we not only don't we idealize the teacher, except as it might be helpful to our journey, but that we also hesitate to give them that power or authority until they've been fully vetted.
Right.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah. And it's such a compassionate thing to do, right? To observe without suspicion, but it's getting to both of your points, to care, right? To care for the experience of the teacher. Right? The Dharma is also, right, it's about caring for each other and doing everything we can to reduce suffering. And so many teachers are suffering privately because there's so little room for their subjectivity to be more on view. And I've often just hoped that there could be ways to support sanghas in simultaneously respecting, right, deeply respecting their teachers as they hold the room for the teacher's suffering to be known and cared for.
And it is awareness that we're teaching.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Non-judgmental awareness.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I don't know about the non-judgmental part. When you're looking at a teacher for 15 years, I think you're allowed a little judgment.
So we're looking at Melvin.
Yes.
Because I think it's a good time
Yes.
for us to hear from some of you. We'd like to take the next half hour for questions.
So I'll be the moderator of the questions. I would just note that we have about half an hour, which is not a lot of time. So I would urge you to make your questions short and to make them questions. We'll start with one person from each side. So let's start with this gentleman here on this side, and then the lady who got her hand up on that side will be the second question.
Thank you. Is this working? It's been wonderful.
Yes.
Listening to you, I wonder if there shouldn't be a threshold age.
A what?
A threshold age before which young people are allowed to practice.
I would defer to the analyst who started practicing, it sounded like when you were 12.
Yeah, even younger. Well, I think it's an interesting question, right? Because depending on which clinician you're oriented toward, most of us don't really have that part of us, you could call it a superego, that is bearing witness to our behavior until we're 7, 8. Right? The first 6 years, there's a lot of id-based energy. However, I think there are all sorts of beautiful Dharma programs now for children that are very, very gentle, very non-coercive, right? That are not trying to teach them a morality of being, but just to introduce them to the notion of observing the mind, right? Observing the body, right? Just cultivating that reflective function. So I think actually the Dharma can work very beautifully at any developmental stage, as long as, again, it's gentle and it's attuned to the capacities of that particular stage.
What comes to mind are sanghas that have a lot of children in them, and then it becomes more like what we're familiar with in the Western world, in our churches, where there's children's groups and so forth. So that might be a little different from the 17-year-old girl that I think may have been part of that question, right? So how to work with the very young or vulnerable.
Thank you all very much. I would like to ask,
Could you stand up so we can see you, please?
Cool.
Thank you.
There you
Great.
are.
You can't see me if I'm not standing
I can
up.
see you.
All right, thank you. So because in the later half of the conversation, all three of you mentioned the responsibility of the Sangha, the community as a whole, and also of students to give room for the teacher's suffering. So I've been thinking of that responsibility also in connection with humility. So like, I know that in the Tibetan tradition, it's very emphasized that as a student, we must approach the teacher with humility. And there's a lot of, I think that there's a lot of point for that. Like, if I don't approach the teacher with humility, I don't learn as much. And I think that, how do you balance that? So the humility part and also the acknowledging of the imperfection of the teacher.
Yeah, look at me. I'm dressed up like a Zen teacher. And yet I'm quite happy to acknowledge verbally, regularly, that I'm not perfect. And in doing that, I am modeling humility that you're talking about. I'm just modeling it. And I think that's I see that as one of the things that I must do. It's one of my jobs, as I call it. Is to model that and show our humanity. And when I'm upset, when I'm sad, I tell people about it. So I think that lowers that kind of idealization that you're talking about. Lowers I'm an ordinary person. And in Japan, where I have practiced, everyone, since the early 19th century, there was a rule that all the priests had to marry or should marry. And so they all have families in all the temples, so it's like it's the mother and father who are running it's very ordinary. I mean, it's like people are ordinary people. They are not enlightened beings standing 20 feet tall. And so I think that really helps also. And to feel that you're not above the Sangha. You are part of the Sangha. You're just, certain times you have a certain role. And that role is to offer the teachings.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I know what you mean. As a Sangha member, it can feel very bold, depending on the dynamics between the teacher, right? Especially if it's a revered, famous guru, right? To inquire about their personal well-being. And it can seem somehow mutually exclusive from the humility that you want to embody. But to Enkyo's point, I think this can be an interesting way to discern for those 15 years, right? Is this teacher able to offer a glimpse into their humanness? And if not, right, I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is always saying, I'm just an ordinary monk. It's the blind leading the blind, right? The best teachers do this all the time. So when they don't, I think that's something to just be aware of.
And that's a kind of interesting edge,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
For a teacher, because there's the need also to, as Pat's saying, so Enkyo, sorry.
Whatever, many names.
Reverend. What was I saying? Oh, it's a kind of edge, because at the same time, as I said, you were saying, you're modeling the qualities that of an awake mind.
Right.
So, and of course, the teacher has to do that with humility too. So that may be paradoxical, but I think therein is the most beautiful gem, the most beautiful diamond that's being polished all the time in practice, right? So that we have some confidence in the Dharma and in our practices as practitioners, and there is complete humility in approaching it at the same time. And although it may appear to be paradoxical, I think it's quite harmonious.
So I'll choose the next two questioners, one from each side of the room. So first there, and then there, and then after. I'll get you.
Thank you all for the wonderful dialogue. In going through all the various permutations of your discussion, there were some things that I thought you might want to address a little bit more. One is that it comes from me from a great wise person called Mae West. I'm not perfect, but parts of me are excellent. Which comes down to that we are all, as human beings and as beings in the universe, we're going through a dialogue between our perfection and our imperfections, between our excellences and our not yet excellences. And therefore, we might want to use that realization to come back to a definition of leadership and authority that I grew up with as a Christian, which is essentially it's service. It's service. If you think of service, rather than authority, rather than power, rather than, I'm always right and you're always wrong, service leads us to dialogue with ourselves and with others. If you want to comment.
So I have a quote for you from Suzuki Roshi, who looked at his students and said, "You're all perfect just as you are, and you could use a little work."
Yeah.
And yes, we are, we may not want to talk about authority or power, but isn't that the elephant in the room, right? So if we're not talking about it, we're abusing it. Because we're not being conscious. Yes, and the silence is toxic and is very, very harmful, because then students begin to lose confidence in their own intuitions. And so they see something happening with the teacher, and they think that there's something wrong with their perception, rather than there is something awry with the teacher. So that we're constantly, and so we're dancing on that edge all the time too, of knowing when to call it, right? And as Enkyo is saying so beautifully, really also the humility includes the disclosure of one's humanity and the complexity of that humanity, where we can be perfect and still need a little work.
Teachers in some traditions, such as, I know this occurs in Theravada, I believe in every tradition, have precepts of renunciation, such as celibacy or not handling money. Do you think that those can have a protective effect on teachers or students?
So it's certainly in my tradition, which is a monastic, mainly the root of it is a monastic tradition. There is celibacy required, but we were talking before we came out about the Catholic Church and the abuses there, and whether celibacy really is useful as a way of separating the laity from the monks or from teachers. I think that's a real conversation that needs to be had. We were also talking about I was saying that in doing my research for this evening, one of the stories that I came across was about impregnated nuns in the Catholic Church who'd been raped, essentially, by priests who were cast out. Because with the celibacy rules comes a whole lot of secrecy and shame and all ways in which things become distorted. So I think it's a really beautiful conversation to have, whether it's still a useful tool. And the handling of money, similarly, what does that mean? And I know in my tradition, when I have monks staying at my house, it's awkward in terms of getting them from the airport to the house without them handling money, and somebody has to go with them to the ticket counter to transact all of the business. And I don't know if in 2019 that is still useful.
So you would lean towards reevaluating these traditions?
Yes, to evaluating it. I don't lean one way or another, but I think it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Thank you.
And I might just add, I'm also in a monastic tradition, and so I can really appreciate, as many of us can, the power, the beauty of having the capacity to consciously work with very strong parts of our human condition, right? To be able to work with our sexuality in such a skillful way and transform it, sublimate it for the good of all sentient beings. But there probably are very few people who can do so skillfully. And the psyche just doesn't like to feel split, right? So to have to split off sexuality, I'm not suggesting that all monastics do that, but some do, right? It's a lot to have to contain. So I really agree with Gina. I think we need to have an active conversation about that process, that choice. Yeah.
And I think that that's the root of a lot of the misogyny in Buddhism. So this body tells me that that's not cool, right? And that there is something that is awry when half of the population, the bodies of half of the population are deemed to be dirty, unclean, and where misogyny is actually a part of the tradition in which nuns walk behind monks. No matter how senior they are, they'll walk behind. They have to walk behind a monk who is one day a monk. So if that's what it leads to, then I think it bears examination.
So I'd take a question from way at the back on this side. So that gentleman who's got his hand up will be next, and then this gentleman here will be afterwards from this side.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if you think that the concept of enlightenment with a capital E which is foundational to so many traditions, you know, in these great mythologies of the Buddha and Padmasambhava or other teachers, these heroic figures can be problematic because many people who are attracted to these traditions are attracted by these sort of mythologies and the idea of enlightenment as a form of perfected cognition. And what you seem to be proposing is a kind of postmodern Buddhism that would be a reform, in a sense, of those traditions. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I was reading a piece of something that was written, a commentary on a sutra that was just uncovered at the Dongwang Caves in China. And it describes, it's a funny little story that this piece tells about how it says, you have a beautiful rock in your backyard, and you like to go and sit on it, and sometimes you like to go and lean up against it, and it's so great. Then one day you decide to bring a painter in and have him paint a picture of the Buddha on the rock. Then you can no longer sit on the rock. Then you can no longer lie down and take a nap on the rock. You'll have to. And that's what I think about enlightenment.
That's good. Yeah.
That was very zen.
I know.
So, but
I don't know. I had to say something.
well, yeah, well, you are who you are. But what it reminded me of is the, you know, the reputed last words of the Buddha, which is be a light unto yourself.
Yeah.
And strive on with heedfulness. It's the final instruction that he gave. And yet, in so many ways, we encourage credulousness in our students, right? To not see the things that are actually right in front of their eyes in terms of the behavior of teachers.
Yes.
So be a light unto yourself is really, for me, a powerful and important instruction.
Right.
Wasn't there a famous Roshi who said, enlightenment is getting to a point where you finally know how neurotic you are? I was like that.
Yeah.
And maybe seeing the neurosis, but with the gentleness, with the curiosity, with the compassion, right? It's not too shameful to see anymore.
It's beautiful.
And you've got 3 people here who devoted their lives to something.
Good point.
So we've only got a few more minutes. You'll be next, and but also I would urge all of us now to keep our questions as short as possible so we can get in as many questions as possible.
Okay, so I'll try to be very short. Thank you very much. So you've talked about the considerable power that is given to teachers, or that's inherent to a teacher-student relationship, and you've talked about ways by which you're aware of that extent and ways to mitigate the risk of it being abused. But are there thoughts also around changing the nature of the relationship between a student and a teacher so as to diminish perhaps or change the power that goes with it? You know, the underlying thought there is that aren't you bound to experience abuses if the power you give people is too great, and particularly when devotion is involved? You know, isn't there something fundamentally wrong, or fundamentally risky, if you will, in doing so?
The complexity of being human, isn't it? Right? It's really complex. What you're pointing to is the complexity of needing guidance, especially, you know, because if we're in the dark, we need to flip a light switch rather than trying to fumble around in the dark, trying to find what we want. So that's the function of a teacher, isn't it? So do we stay in darkness and hope that somehow the light will come and we'll find what we're looking for? Or is it more efficacious, sorry for the use of that word, to actually have someone who guides you and to beware the warning signals on the package?
I don't think devotion and critical thinking are mutually exclusive, right? So you can be devoted to whomever, to your partner, to your dear friend, to your teacher, right? And have a reflective capacity that helps you see a fuller truth about who you're in relationship to and what's happening between the two of you. But maybe to your point, one way of discerning the relative health of the relationship is to see if some mutuality is possible, right? I mean, can the devotion shift and change and grow over time? Yeah, or does it stay in that more childlike, and I don't say that in a pejorative way, but right, in that earlier developmental stage?
If you could just pass the mic immediately to your left.
Thanks very much for this evening. Concentrate, Moshe. Okay. So I'm going to refer to the yoga world because that's where my question comes from. There was a yoga school that had something, I took a teacher training with them, and they had in their manual what they set out as the relationship that they advised between the teacher and the student, and vice versa with the student and the teacher. But yet I saw constant instances where this was violated, and I wondered, is there a way to have something, a body in process, or a body that can look at these violations, particularly between a teacher and a student, and bring about a, what's the word, bring about the responsibility of the teacher of, oh, you stepped over a line and now there are consequences. What, I don't know what you all think of that. I can't think of the right words, but I hope that makes sense.
As I mentioned, at Spirit Rock we have what's called an air council, where those kinds of issues can be brought, and the council is made up of teachers, board members, community members. What I worry about with it is that teachers do have outsized power, right? So that if it's a complaint against a teacher, you know, I don't know, and I'm not making any allegations, I'm just concerned and noticing the complexity of teachers being in powerful position in our Dharma communities and in our Dharma institutions, that the way, at least in my tradition, the way we've grown up, is that the teachers were the ones who were founders, and then they became board members, and then, you know, so their authority is in many ways unquestioned. So if a teacher comes, if a student has a complaint against a teacher, and they come before the Air Council, I'm concerned. I'm not alleging anything. I'm just concerned that it's clear, and my lawyer's mind says that, you know, there's structures that can be put in place where people recuse themselves, etc. But I don't know how sophisticated we are as Dharma organizations in really putting those complex systems together yet. Hopefully we will grow. We're growing into it, and hopefully we'll get better as time goes on.
Good.
So I think we'll have time for one more question, which now should come from this side of the room, right in front of you.
I'm thinking a lot about this, and my major experience, as Roshi knows, is with the village Zendo, where the default to complex problems is usually kindness. But then I began to think about organizational models. The organizational model there is very distributed. There is a strong group of teachers who are both intimate with each other and with the Sangha. And I began to think that most of my experience of stories of misuse of power are very different. It's a much more hierarchical, one person in charge. So my interest was, are the organizational models changing? And what effect will that have on the use or abuse of power?
We were talking earlier about that, and Gina and I were both saying that team teaching, or having more than one teacher in a Sangha, is really so wonderful. It so rebalances the energies. You know, we have like 4 and 2 coming up in a little Sangha. So that really makes a difference, I think, in terms of the power. And kind of answers your question, too, because someone who is in the room, maybe not actively teaching at the time, but is in the room witnessing something that seems off, is able to work that. And I also agree very much with what you were saying, Gina. We're still working that. How do you have ombudsman and a different group that can listen to the issues that come up? I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
So that will conclude our panel discussion, and it's my pleasure on behalf of Lion's Roar, of the Rubin Museum of Art, of those of us who are watching this discussion, both here and in person and via live stream and in the future, to thank our panelists. I'm struck by something that you said, Roshi, about this being an exciting time, or it's time. And the brilliance and insight of you is an indication to me of what years of Buddhist practice has given us, or via you, has given us via you, and how Buddhism in this country is evolving and maturing and developing deeper insights. As you said, silence is a form of suppression. This conversation would never even have happened decades ago, and it certainly would have never happened with this level of insight and astuteness and honesty. And I think that's a sign of progress, both of Buddhism in America and indeed hopeful progress in the society as a whole. So I really want to thank you for a brilliant and wise and thoughtful discussion.
Thank you.